Good evening, parents and carers and anyone else watching, and a huge happy new year. I hope you had a restful and enjoyable winter break and you enjoyed time just stopping, slowing down and spending time with your children. Welcome to our first episode of our Lent webinar series. I'm delighted to welcome this evening Iain Mahony, and he's probably smiling in the background. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And before I introduce Iain, I just wanted to do a bit of housekeeping and say that we're not expecting any technical difficulties this evening, but if we do encounter any, please do bear with us. Our next webinar is next Monday, the 20th of January, and that's going to be led by some SLT members, including myself, and we've already sent some information about that, and that's going to be on our updated phone policy with some guidance for parents and carers. So please do join us next Monday, January the 20th, to hear more about that. We have a great relationship with Iain. Myself and Miss Arthur have known Iain for a few years now, and he does feel part of our Forest family. Your children probably know him a bit more, especially the middle school. They speak so highly of Iain when he comes to speak to them. And I would say we have a variety of excellent speakers, but they are really positive about Iain. So I just want to publicly thank Iain for what he's done for the Forest pupils and how much support he has given to the RSHE curriculum. Iain's actually going to be back with us. We've worked out, we think it's for the fourth time with pupils in June to speak to year 10. And we're delighted to have him back. He's also going to be contributing to our RSHE conference that we lead with external schools to really ensure that our RSHE programme is leading and outstanding in the area. So he's someone that's not new to us at Forest, and what's really nice is now we can share his expertise with you as parents and carers. And just as a reminder, this leads on really seamlessly from our speaker that we had in our last webinar series, Fiona Spargo-Mabs from the Daniel Spargo Foundation. So once you've watched this, if you haven't seen that webinar, it's on our live page on our YouTube channel. Please do have a look on the story that Fiona shares about her son Daniel, because this is, as we say, Forest Focus Webinars is all about a collection of webinars under a broad umbrella. So this is kind of our next stage in that area. So let me tell you a bit about Iain. Iain went to Uppingham, where he was outwardly successful in the rugby teams, on stage, a school prefect and a house captain. So you can see why he connects with Forest pupils who are also so busy. And at Manchester University, Iain, he graduated with honours and he entered the city and secured a dream job as a personal trainer in Mayfair. I think he could do a bit of work with me after Christmas with my fitness, actually. Behind the scenes, though, he was in crisis and his drug and alcohol use were out of control. Iain's confident demeanour, as I'm sure you'll see this evening, hid his demons well. Low self-worth, anxiety and a desperate desire to please others. To ease the pain for over a decade, he was habitually using cocaine, weed and alcohol. Slowly crashing at 32, he was admitted to a rehabilitation centre. Having got the professional help he needed, Iain has been clean and sober for over 10 years. Iain has dedicated himself to understanding the various challenges of growing up. Iain's talks helped pupils, parents and carers, like this evening, and teachers to address sensitive issues safely and effectively. And as I said at Forest, we've seen that firsthand. Iain's style is easy to relate to, free from judgment or preaching, and the talks encourage people to open up and have those difficult conversations. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Iain. Thank you so much, Iain.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Actually very moved by such a warm and lovely welcome. Thank you very much. My name's Iain. I've been speaking in independent schools since 2017. I've spoken at over 100 leading independent schools in the UK. My talks, as Natasha just said so clearly, are designed very much to help educate people and to make people more aware of the various mental health challenges. The talk tonight is focusing on addiction. I am a recovering drug addict and alcoholic. The talk that I've delivered to the pupils has been my original talk, which is called A Slow Crash. and that is a very thorough and very candid account of my problems, and covers my life from early childhood all the way through to the present day. The talk this evening is called We Need to Talk, and it is designed to work in conjunction with a slow crash, but you don't need to have heard that for this to make sense or be relevant. And the goal of tonight's session is to try and open people's minds to the various perspectives and theories on addiction. When I got sober, like many people who are struggling, I faced a number of challenges. The first one was that I was totally and utterly preoccupied with the fact that I had a drug and alcohol problem. And I now realise that regardless of what the addiction is, whether it was gambling or food or spending, codependent relationships, people tend to get very, very preoccupied and probably spend a disproportionate amount of their time focusing on the addiction rather than focusing on what has led them to have the addiction in the first place. And tonight's session is designed to look at the incredibly interesting but also incredibly confusing subject of addiction. The reason why I've put the first slide up with all of these images is just to show that addiction affects people from all walks of life. One of the problems with addiction, in terms of people's perception of it and the way that they tend to respond to it, is that it is often seen, and there used to be an advertising campaign in the 80s talking about cancer was something that happened to somebody else or other people. And I think addiction would fall under that bracket as well. People tend to have a perception of addiction as being something that wouldn't happen to them or people in their close family or to their children. And unfortunately, addiction does affect people from all walks of life. And the 6 people that I've put up on the screen are 6 iconic, famous people in their respective fields who have all had issues with addiction. That's obviously just explaining what the talk is. To start with, obviously you won't be standing up. You can stand up if you want to, but this is just designed to be a little soft opener to just give people a bit of an insight into some kind of common questions around addiction. The first one is, what percentage of the UK population will struggle with addiction? And if you've all got your minds up, obviously I can't tell if you're lying with your scores at the end, but I'll trust all of you to be honest. It's estimated to be 10 to 15% of the population that will struggle with an addiction. To clarify, the 10 to 15%, their life will become unmanageable. Their addiction will have a significant impact on their ability to function and cope on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, as we'll see later, the numbers in regards to social media and particularly phone use in terms of an addiction or an unhealthy relationship are significantly higher than 10 to 15%. The second question is, every GP is responsible for how many addicts? There's a guy called Robert Lefevre who we'll look at later, who is one of the pioneers of addiction research and also addiction treatment in the UK. And this is a statistic that he brought up based on research that was done in London. And the answer is that every GP, particularly in cities, will have at least 300 people that they're dealing with who have got an addiction. And it's very important to point out that GPs are not given training to deal with an addiction. And in the face of an addiction or somebody who is struggling to control typically something like alcohol consumption, they will always try and use the sort of safer use harm reduction model, which is to moderate. And unfortunately, as we'll see later, one of the big problems with addiction is that people will often try over and over and again to control an addiction by moderating what they're doing. And the problem is that what they typically tend to do is try and control the symptoms rather than looking at the underlying cause, which is actually leading them to drink or gamble or take drugs or take part in any other addictive substance or behaviour. The third one, which is very, very important, again, Natasha talked about the wonderful talk from the speaker last week, Mrs. Spargo Marks. It's very important to point out as well, addiction, and I can say this, not trying to be self-deprecating or critical, but just being very objective about it. People with an addiction, particularly when they are struggling at the latter end and they are sort of approaching what is called the rock bottom, or when they're in early recovery, tend to be very, very self-obsessed and sometimes have a complete inability to recognize the fact that their addiction is causing an enormous amount of discomfort, pain and uncertainty for the people around them. And it's estimated that every addiction affects the lives of at least 5 other people. And obviously that would be dependent on the size of your family, whether you're self-employed, whether you're in a relationship. But it's very important to point out that whether you're looking at it from a pragmatic or a practical perspective, the better we can be at understanding and dealing with addiction, we not only help to improve the quality of life of people who are struggling, but also the people in their inner circle who, as I say, are quite often affected, perhaps not quite to the same extent, but they are really affected by addiction. This is I find this quite a difficult statistic to read, but it's a very important one, which is what percentage of young people are using to escape their problems, as opposed to using recreationally or for medical reasons. And that is now 40%. The use of drugs, the most reliable data around drug use in the 16 to 24 demographic is that the numbers have been relatively stable for a few years, which is around 18% of 16 to 24-year-olds have tried drugs or are using drugs. So that number is fairly consistent and fairly stable. The thing that is important that has really, really changed, it is the motivation for using drugs. And previously, a huge majority of the people that were using drugs were using them for recreational purposes. And it's very quick to point out that just because you're taking drugs recreationally, it doesn't mean that you're not encountering an enormous number of risks. Buying drugs from people who are particularly unscrupulous and potentially violent and untrustworthy. You also don't know, because drugs aren't regulated, what you're actually buying. You may think that you're buying ketamine or ecstasy or MDMA or cocaine or whatever, but you don't actually know that what you're buying from somebody is what you think you're buying. So there are risk factors involved with recreational or addictive drug use. But the thing which is very concerning in terms of the likelihood of people transitioning from recreational use to compulsive daily use is the fact that so many people's motivation for using drugs is that they're either trying to escape from their problems or they're trying to use drugs to help them deal with their problems. And that would also include mental health issues. So unfortunately, I think we do have a very increased susceptibility with that demographic of people who are likely to transition from recreational to addictive use. What percentage of people relapse after a year of completing treatment? It's very important to point out when I say this number, which is incredibly high, it is 85% of people will struggle and will typically relapse. But that doesn't mean that 85% of people who try and get sober fail to get sober. It means that it quite often takes people more than one go to actually manage to maintain long-term sobriety. And I think it's important to point out with this, a lot of people understandably would say the reason that people struggle to stay sober is because the compulsion to use drink or drugs or gamble is so strong that they can't control that instinct or that impulse. And I would actually say that one of the things from personal experience and anecdotally with the people that I was in treatment with and the thousands of people I've met over the last 10 years who've struggled with addiction, is that what often drives people to relapse is not the fact that they want to repeat the same pattern of behavior again. It's the fact that when they stop engaging with their addiction, the underlying cause, that underlying driver, becomes a lot more prominent. And because most people haven't had to deal with that problem, they are then finding themselves in a very precarious position, which is their coping mechanism, which is quite often drugs or whatever other addiction they're indulging in, has gone. And because they don't have an alternative, because they haven't been sober for long enough to actually develop strong, healthy coping mechanisms, they revert back to what they were doing before. But it isn't because they want to be hedonistic and self-indulgent or to be reckless. They just can't cope with the emotional turmoil and coming face to face with the actual cause of their addiction. As I say, and I think the substance and the behaviour tends to be more of a symptom of a deeper underlying problem. What percentage of UK teenagers felt that they were addicted to social media? That's 48%. And there is data that the number of young people who say that they have issues with their phone, they feel like they have an unhealthy relationship with their phone, could be as high as about 70%. So as you said earlier, addictions vary in terms of their severity. But if you say to somebody, do you feel you have a healthy relationship with alcohol, with your phone, with relationships, with gambling, with food, somebody may be on a continuum, and just because they haven't got to the point where their life is completely unmanageable and they've still got some semblance of control, it doesn't mean that their relationship is healthy. And you could argue that they still have an addictive relationship, but it just hasn't reached that point in terms of severity. I'm not a neuroscientist, clearly, but I think it's very important when we look at addiction to try and look at it from multiple different facets. I found it helpful to understand a little bit more about the brain, and I will try and keep it fairly brief and fairly succinct because I don't want to turn it into a biology or a neurology session. But I think it is important to understand what is going on cognitively when people become addicted. The first part of the brain which is affected is called the amygdala, which is in the temporal lobe. And the way I always remember that is temporal in terms of temper. Your amygdala is part of your reptilian brain. So we effectively have two sections of the brain: the neocortex, which is the more developed part of our brain, which allows us to be more sophisticated and thoughtful and considerate. It's much more cerebral. And the amygdala is that part of the reptilian brain, which is very responsible for instinct and survival. So if you think of things like reproduction, thirst, hunger, anger, if somebody is threatened or challenged in terms of their basic survival, it will be the amygdala, which is a very sort of small walnut size shape of element of the brain, which will be activated. And it is responsible for what people tend to think of with sort of fight or flight. When somebody becomes addicted to something, particularly substances, their amygdala becomes heightened and overly activated, and it's very, very difficult for the amygdala to calm back down again, which means that people who are addicted to a substance tend to be agitated, aggressive, very short-tempered. They lack the ability to make good choices, and they tend to react much more on instinct and on impulse rather than having the patience and the consideration or the perspective to think logically and rationally. In conjunction with that, the second part of the brain that's affected is in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for what we call executive function, which is making, again, good choices. The frontal lobe is almost the opposite of the amygdala. It's that part of your brain that allows you to strategize, to make plans, to think ahead, and generally be a lot more considered and deliberate in your speech, your actions, and your thoughts. That becomes down-regulated. There's a lot of work by somebody in America called Dr. Daniel Amen, and he has said that when people start to engage in compulsive behaviors, the two things that he looks at particularly are mobile phones and alcohol, but this is also very important as well for pornography use. If somebody starts drinking or doing one of those other things from the age of about 11 or 12, there is evidence that because their brain isn't fully formed, they are drastically increasing their risk of developing a problematic relationship because they are effectively impairing their executive function. And it is also important to point out in terms of a kind of gender differential, if you look at all the data in terms of intelligence, there is very, very little, if any, difference in intelligence between teenage boys and teenage girls. It's very flat. They are roughly as intelligent as each other. The thing that differs markedly is the period just after puberty, particularly between the ages of about 14 and 16. Girls have a much faster development of their executive function, which means as teenagers, they tend to be more pragmatic, more thoughtful, more considered, more careful, and they will focus more on schoolwork and their appearance and making sure that they are presenting well because they have this awareness that what they're doing will have an impact and an implication on future behaviours and outcomes. So we can call that the brake mechanism. Teenage boys in the same age group, unfortunately for them, because it is a developmental lag, will struggle to have the same level of consideration and thought and planning. And as a result, they have a much stronger accelerator, which means they're much, much likelier to engage in impulsive and risk-taking behaviour. And there's quite often that comment from teachers when they're talking to a 14 or 15-year-old boy, and they will say, "What on earth are you doing? Why are you doing that? What do you think is going to happen?" And the answer is, for 14 and 15-year-olds, they aren't thinking about that because their brain is just not leading them in such a strategic, considered pattern. So I think it is important to point out that for teenage boys, there is going to be a stronger impulse to kind of act out and engage in alcohol and drugs potentially, and also pornography and screen time. And the final part of the brain which is affected is called the basal ganglia, and that's located sort of deep in the brain, and it's a connection of different neurons and covers different sections of the brain. And that is effectively in charge of things like habits, motivation, and action. And that part of the brain will become completely overwhelmed when it comes to addiction. And unfortunately, people talk a lot about neuroplasticity. And again, the younger you are, if you start taking drugs or drinking or gambling, you are effectively laying down neural pathways and patterns of behavior. And because the basal ganglia is so important for motivation, ambition, and also learning patterns of behavior, developing routines, that part of the brain will become very, very fixed. And it means that when you look at those three things together collectively, you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling erratic, you're feeling volatile, you're feeling impulsive. Risk-taking is far likelier because the part of your brain which would normally counteract that behavior is very, very down-regulated. And the part of your brain that would normally enjoy things like walking or reading or cooking or doing anything else that's healthy or going for a run becomes completely and utterly fixated on repeating the same pattern of behavior because the reward is so high and the mechanism for delivering the same feedback is so high. And one of the things that's very confusing for people when they get to the sharp end of an addiction is they will quite often say it's really confusing because it's the anticipation and the motivation to buy drugs or to gamble or to drink, which is so compelling. But when I've bought the drugs or when I've had a drink or when I've put a bet on or when I've spent loads of money on my credit card, I just feel empty. But I keep thinking I will get the same high that I got before. And that's because the basal ganglia is very much, you've got such a strong conditioning towards the behavior, but unfortunately the outcome doesn't match the anticipation. And it's because your wiring is just channeling you towards the same pattern of behavior over and over again, despite the fact that you're not getting the same outcome that you got at the start, which is feeling relaxed, feeling happy, feeling sociable, feeling more confident and outgoing. Robert Lefevre has sort of neatly classified addictions into three different categories. The first one is hedonistic, and that tends to be the group of addictions that get all of the headlines when you think of addiction. It's things like sex, alcohol, gambling, drugs, smoking, all the things that aren't very good for people anyway, particularly if they indulge in sort of gambling and drinking and smoking and things. I mean, sex is obviously important for reproduction, but there are lots of implications for people if they become addicted to sex, because again, they don't get any enjoyment from it. It's just a compulsive behavior. The second one is nurturance of self, and that is the one that quite often confuses people, because the nurturance of self categories and the things that fall into that group, if they're done in moderation, can actually be very healthy for someone. And that would be things like work, exercise, and food. The problem is with those things that if somebody's a workaholic in the UK, I would say that if I had to pick one addiction, which seems to be far more socially acceptable and actually carries some degree of status or approval, it's somebody saying, oh, I'm a complete workaholic. I haven't met that many people who've been in recovery for work addiction, but I know people that it's formed part of their problem, and it's had a really, really kind of detrimental effect on their ability to live and to function, particularly if they're in a relationship or they're a parent. Food, clearly, again, if you eat healthily, it's part of a great balanced lifestyle. But if you're eating either far too much or far too little, or you have something called orthorexia, which is a kind of fixation on eating certain foods in certain portions at certain times, that can become very unhealthy. And exercise addiction for young men and young women, particularly at the moment, there's a lot of evidence, unfortunately, that young men are catching young women up in terms of the incidence of problems with body dysmorphia and compulsive exercising. And the third category, the one which I think is, often sort of underestimated in terms of how significant it is relational problems. I can completely understand why a lot of people who are looking at an addiction can understand that if somebody's taking drugs on a daily basis, or gambling on a daily basis, or spending astronomical amounts of money that they don't have on a credit card on a daily basis, you have a very tangible problem. Because relational addictions tend to be a little bit more abstract and harder to define for some people, it can be difficult to kind of classify them with the same significance as the others. But the big one that I would look at in terms of relational addictions is something called codependence. There is a school of thought, which again is just an idea that somebody has had, which is that the vast majority of people who have an addiction also have a codependent personality trait. And that means that people tend to engage in these other patterns of behavior because they struggle so much with the relationship that they have with themselves, and they also struggle particularly with the relationships that they have with other people. And I would certainly say that one of the things that's been incredibly enlightening, but also incredibly difficult for me over the last 10 years, is that when I abstained from drink and drugs, which were my two main problems in terms of addiction, I really became aware of how codependent I was as a person. And it's taken an enormous amount of work and effort on my part to acknowledge and actually address the fact that I have a really difficult time managing the relationship that I have with myself, and particularly my expectations around relationships with other people, and things like people pleasing and finding it difficult to say no and having healthy boundaries. I do think that's something that's really important to point out, is that not every addiction involves a substance. There are also addictions that are behavior based. The next thing we're going to look at is a really good video. It's a couple of minutes long. There may be a Muller Lite YouTube advert beforehand, so apologies for that, but we will pop that video on. I think that video is a very good graphic representation of, in a very short space of time, it very sort of succinctly illustrates how people get caught up in this pattern of repetition. And I think what it shows is that in the sort of short to medium term, the impulse to use any substance or behavior is so compelling and so strong that despite the fact that there are diminishing returns at every occasion, and at each occasion of use, there is, towards the end, actually quite a sort of significant impact, and it's very, very detrimental and painful. There is that awful dilemma that people get to at the end where they become grudgingly, I think, aware of the fact that what they're doing isn't working, and it isn't giving them pleasure, and it isn't giving them any satisfaction. And I think one of the big distinctions that I would draw from people that drink a lot or smoke a lot or gamble a lot or do anything a lot is that the difference in terms of somebody's likelihood of making that transition from heavy use to addictive use is that when somebody who is drinking too much starts to have consequences as a result of their drinking, for example, it's very common that partners will say to somebody after Christmas, I'm finished. I can't do this. I can't have another Christmas where you promise me that you're not going to get drunk every night and behave awfully and then spend the whole time being hungover and belligerent. If somebody is just drinking too much because they drink too much, they will generally recognize the fact that they are drinking too much and they will stop. And normally their life will improve. And I've heard over the years countless people say, since I stopped drinking, my life has improved so drastically because their problem was that they were drinking too much. What I think this video illustrates in terms of addiction is that even when people are beginning to acknowledge the fact that their substance or behavior isn't giving them that buzz, that high, the confidence that it used to give them, it's the fear of having to acknowledge something deeper and more profound which keeps them going. And even though they're not getting a high anymore, they're achieving some sort of numb state, and they still have this ability to distract themselves with the addiction rather than having to actually acknowledge what's going on underneath. And it's an odd thing to say, but towards the end of an addiction, there is this sort of, it becomes very, it's like looking at the world through a straw. Nothing else matters apart from fulfilling that need, even though the need isn't giving the outcome, because it provides this admittedly awful, but it still provides some form of distraction from reality and the pain that most people are going through. The next one, which I think when I speak to pupils on obviously parents and staff as well and caregivers, I always say that I think this is the most important slide, which is the sort of the historic perspective on addiction. And I'm not looking to ridicule anyone or to mock anyone, because again, it kind of makes sense on a rational level that people would say people need to be mindful of the substance that they use, because if something is more chemically addictive, you are more likely to become addicted to it, which as a sentence doesn't seem to be a particularly silly thing to say. That sounds fairly logical and reasonable. And there used to be a lot of stuff around the addictive personality, that some people were just born with this neurotransmitter sequence or pattern that was different to the majority of the population. As a result, that small group were susceptible because they had addictive personalities. And I developed this talk with a fantastic PSHE and wellbeing lead from a school in Bath, who has done an enormous amount to provide free resources around mental health and particularly drug and alcohol addiction. And the thing that she pointed out to me, which I thought was incredibly interesting, is that all of the research now is indicating that how likely somebody is to become addicted to a substance or behavior, how addictive the substance is. So, for example, if you look at something like cigarettes versus heroin, heroin is far more addictive. But if you look at something like cocaine and marijuana, again, cocaine is far more addictive. But what they're now realizing, it isn't just how chemically addictive a substance is, and it's these three things together which are all important for looking at somebody's risk of developing a problem. And the analogy I would use, or the examples I would use, is that if you took somebody who was taking lots and lots of cocaine or crystal meth, which are both incredibly chemically addictive, but they were doing it in a set of people who they were great friends with, they were having fun, it was part of socializing after doing really well in an exam, and that the setting that they were in was warm and comfortable and safe, and they knew everybody, they knew where they were, and they were in a good headspace. As we said before, it's not to say that that is safe behavior, because there are inherent risks with taking drugs, but they are not very likely to develop an addiction. Equally, if you took somebody smoking weed, which is not as addictive chemically, but they were doing it with people who were incredibly morose, depressed, anxious, they were feeling very low, feeling very anxious, and they were smoking weed in a cold, dark room. They didn't feel comfortable, they didn't feel safe, they didn't particularly like the people that they were hanging around with. They were just doing it because they wanted to try and distract themselves from the problems in their life. That person would have a much higher susceptibility to actually transitioning to doing it addictively, because it's the drug, the set, and the setting which are all really important. And that's why I would say, when we're looking particularly at drug addiction, it's very, very important to look at those other two factors. Some people sort of trivialize them or almost make them secondary or tertiary concerns. And I would say that they are really, really important, because I've never met anybody who was a drug addict who was happy. You have to have some form of discomfort or emotional, physical pain to be using drugs habitually. The other thing which really sort of backs up that perspective on addiction is there's a lot of interesting work by two people called Bruce Alexander and Peter Cohen. Iain Mahony, who is an author that we'll look at in a minute, he has written lots and lots of really interesting books. He tends to sort of pick a subject and do a deep dive on it, and I would really recommend his books. They're fantastic. And he's come across a lot of the research, which is those two researchers. And his argument is, if people became addicted to drugs because drugs are chemically addictive, there are around 100,000 hip replacements in the UK. My mum has recently broken her hip, unfortunately. And one of the medications that she's been given, again, unfortunately, but understandably, to manage her pain in the short to medium term, is she's been given something called morphine. And morphine is effectively medical grade heroin. It's an incredibly strong painkiller. Iain Mahony's point, based on all the research, is that you don't end up with 100,000 pensioners a year becoming addicted to heroin. They take this very, very strong substance for a short period of time for a specific reason, and normally it is to control pain. And ideally, when they get to a point where they've had an operation and a hip replacement, and they've done rehab and physio, and they're no longer in hospital and they're at home, they don't need the medication anymore, and they don't crave it, because the set and the setting are both favourable and good. So they don't have those other two drivers compelling them to keep taking this incredibly addictive substance. And the other example is the Vietnam War. And there were a huge number of troops that were taking heroin and reported that they had a daily habit, that they were addicted to heroin. Of the number of troops, I think it was 20% of the troops that were taking heroin habitually. It was around 80 to 90% of them who, when they left Vietnam and they returned back to the US, they just spontaneously stopped using heroin, despite the fact that in Vietnam they had been daily heroin users. And all the research indicates that when they were in Vietnam, they had an enormous amount of physical, psychological stress. They were away from home, away from their routine. They were also in a country where heroin was incredibly abundant, and it was also incredibly socially acceptable. Nobody, well, I'm sure there were people that did judge, but the vast majority of people had a very open mind about smoking weed, drinking alcohol, and using heroin to help them escape from the horror of being in a war zone. And yet when they went back to the US, the same thing happened. They just spontaneously stopped taking the drug because the set and the setting both changed, and there were obviously very different legal rules and regulations and laws around how permissible it was to actually obtain and use heroin without punishment. These are 6 of the people that I think have very interesting theories and perspectives on addiction. The person in the bottom right-hand corner is someone called Dr. Anna Lemke, and she's written a brilliant book called Dopamine Nation. And she makes a really interesting point in her book based on her research, which is that people tend to think of addiction in very binary terms. You either are or you aren't. And her argument, her theory is that addiction is actually a spectrum disorder. If you're somebody who is habitually stealing and committing crimes to fund a drug habit, you end up in prison and you just can't get sober, you are clearly someone who most people would recognize as being an addict. But her argument is that we live in a world of absolute abundance, and whether it's the news, whether it's your phone, whether it's alcohol, chocolate, exercise, social media, everybody has an unhealthy relationship with something. It is just that the vast majority of people don't ever get to the point where their addiction is unmanageable. But if you ask most people, do you feel that you sometimes use your phone when you don't want to and you're not quite sure why? It's just a compulsion to reach your hand out and pick your phone up. Based on the evidence from before, 64% of people, teenagers, may have been in their 40s. I think it was the 60 that was the phone. But there's certainly a significant proportion of teenagers who have an issue with social media and their phone, but it isn't derailing their lives. The person above is Johann Hari, who is the author. His view is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's actually connection. And his argument is that anybody that's addicted to anything is effectively struggling to maintain healthy connections and to be present in their life. And he looks at the fact that you can abstain from drugs and alcohol or any other addiction, but still be incredibly unhappy. And the way that you both achieve sobriety and contentment and fulfillment is to find a new purpose and to connect with something, because that is ultimately what you've been lacking when you were addicted. The chap in the middle, the top middle, is Dr. Robert Lefevre. His view is that 1 in 6 people, so around that 15% of people, have what he calls a neurotransmission disease. And his belief is that 15% of the population have an addictive personality. I have met people over the years who have struggled a lot more with sobriety. And even though they've normally had an underlying driver which has been making them feel unhappy, that they've been trying to cope with or escape from, there are definitely people in recovery who I know who seem to have a harder time mentally and physically abstaining from drink and drug use. So even though the addictive personality thing has kind of been discredited to an extent, I would say anecdotally that there are people I know who have managed to give up drugs and alcohol and gambling, but they find it impossible to give up sugar and cigarettes and coffee. And they, despite the fact they really want to, they just seem to have a stronger physiological driver. The woman in the top left is a brilliant doctor from America called Dr. Sally Satel. And she makes a really interesting point, which is that the vast majority of people who have an addiction are suffering with what she calls this sort of profound psychic distress. And her point is that the key things that people need to do in this order when they're trying to get sober is that the first stage is very much getting the symptoms under control. And people, and I fall into this category, quite often when they find out there is a deeper underlying problem, they want to tackle that too quickly. And they would be far better off devoting a certain amount of time, anywhere between 6 months and 18 months, to really focusing on abstaining from their problematic behavior. And then after that, they can start to look at the things that were making them so unhappy in the first place. The bottom left is someone called Peter Hitchens. He has a very interesting view of addiction. His brother was Christopher Hitchens, who was a real sort of bon vivant and public intellectual, incredibly bright. They both are. But Peter Hitchens' view is that addiction is a series of incredibly bad choices. And he says that addiction, and particularly drug addiction, is the purest expression of self-indulgent hedonistic behavior. And that if you commit, in his eyes, if you commit a crime, regardless of your emotional, spiritual, psychological, physical well-being and the things that have happened to you, you are making a bad choice, and ultimately you have the ability to stop making bad choices. But he very much goes down the kind of traditional Western model of punishing people with addictions. I can see his point to an extent, but I think it's a little bit simplistic. And the one that I've saved for the end, who I would recommend anybody who's trying to understand addiction in greater detail would do really well to read his books, is Dr. Gabor Mate. And the question that he poses, which I think is incredibly relevant and thought-provoking, particularly for friends and family and partners or colleagues of people that are struggling with an addiction, is that people will very often, understandably, ask the wrong question, which is, why the addiction? And he said that's an understandable question, but it's not the right question. And the right question in his mind is why the pain? Why is this person repeating the same self-destructive pattern of behavior for weeks, months, years, potentially decades, even though they don't get any satisfaction, any fulfillment, any enjoyment, and their addiction has actually just become another source of pain and discomfort and confusion? What is it that's making this person keep repeating that pattern of behavior? And his view is that, again, as a society, we tend to focus far too much on the addiction, and we fail to look at the underlying driver. So we spend a lot of time trying to punish and manage the symptoms rather than challenging, addressing and healing the root cause. I've put that image up there because I think it's very important to, and again, this isn't supposed to sort of, I don't want to evoke pity, but I think it's very difficult for people. I now realise, having been sober for 10 years, that one of the problems with addiction is that people who are suffering can often feel very unique, that their pain is unique, and that no one can quite understand the depth of their pain and their discomfort and their confusion. And I've realised that most people in addiction have variations on a theme in terms of how they're feeling. And being in my 40s and having met a lot of people in recovery, and also met a lot of people in life who have never really struggled with an addiction, but have had bereavement and pain in other elements of their life, I now realise that addiction is by no means the only source of pain. But it's a very confusing thing, I think, because of the stigma around addiction and particularly around recovery. And the reason I've picked that image is because I think it's a pretty stark but very strong and accurate sort of graphic representation of the fact that when people are sober and they're in very early recovery, they almost feel like they're sort of suspended in a bit of a vacuum, because they know that they can't carry on doing what they've been doing for the last however many years. And they're aware of all of the shame, all of the embarrassment, all of the guilt, a lot of the time pretty serious amounts of self-loathing. And all they know is that their previous mode of adaptation, their previous behaviours were so maladaptive and awful, but they have absolutely no idea how they're supposed to live and deal with life around paying bills and getting a job and having a relationship, because so much of that stuff has been tied into their addiction and trying to live a sober life. There's a lot of evidence that people, when they start becoming addicted, have arrested development. And for a lot of people, the age that they started to have problems with addiction, which for me was in my early 20s, that there is a certain amount of cognitive and emotional arrested development, and people can be very immature and struggle with what can seem like fairly kind of innocuous, mundane tasks. And becoming sober is not just giving up all of the things that you used to do. It's quite often giving up your friendship group, giving up all the places you used to hang out. And when you are getting sober, it's acknowledging the fact that all you've ever done, particularly for the final 5 years or so, it is just take drugs or drink or gamble or spend or whatever it is. And now you have to find different sources of enjoyment, different sources of fulfillment, and you have to build your self-esteem, your self-worth, try and make amends with the people that you've let down and hurt. And I would never say that to condone or excuse bad behaviour, but I would say to people that when somebody is in early recovery, I've worked with a few families with relatives who have been struggling, and particularly young men. And I have said to them, I think it's very important to, particularly with parents who are middle class and are quite driven and understandably, quite image conscious. This isn't taking a car into a garage and getting an MOT. You can't spend money and fix this problem in a very short space of time. This is a multifaceted, potentially emotional, psychological problem that's going to need a lot of reassurance and a lot of effort from the person who's struggling, but also a lot of understanding and a lot of time, because it typically takes around a year, in my experience, for most people to actually feel like they have regained a level of emotional and psychological stability after such an erratic, volatile period in their life. These are just some of the things that I think of. Oh, hasn't turned up. With coping. Sorry, we had a bit of an issue with slides beforehand. In terms of the things that people are typically trying to cope with, the things that I would normally encourage people to think of are things like physical pain, emotional pain or trauma, loss and grief. Uncertainty can be a big thing. There was a huge spike during the pandemic, with people reporting that they had started to have a problem with alcohol, because for the first time in their life, they were stuck at home, they were stuck with their thoughts, and they had no idea what the outcomes for the future were going to be. And as a result, there was this huge spike in the amount of people, as I say, reporting the fact that they didn't feel that they were able to moderate or control their alcohol use. And the final one, which I normally call the sort of chicken and egg, is mental health, which is, does somebody take drugs or drink or gamble because they have a mental health problem, or do they have a mental health problem because they're engaging in those behaviours? And the evidence is that it's around 50-50. 50% of people with a serious mental health problem that isn't being addressed and managed will normally gravitate towards an addiction. And from my experience, that tends to be drugs and alcohol if people have got issues with anxiety, depression, or a more serious kind of emotional, psychological disorder. The final ones, obviously you are all caregivers and parents. I'm not a parent and I'm not a teacher, so I'm very conscious of not giving people advice, but I do like to try and give suggestions. And I would say that if you are looking after somebody, or you have somebody in your care who is behaving in a way that you feel is not consistent with who they typically are, and obviously, again, if you spend a lot of time with teenagers, which I do, I'm aware of the fact that teenagers are going through, particularly now, it's a very, very difficult economic climate, and there's been changes with VAT, and there's a lot of pressure on school fees and social media and hundreds of other things that we could draw on, which are big stresses for teenagers. But the fact is, despite the fact they are going through this period of adolescence where they are undergoing changes in their personality and their physical and mental state, if you're looking after somebody for a sustained period of time and you just feel that their behavior is off, I would say that the best thing that you can do is to have a conversation. And all of the evidence that I've read around how to approach it is what's called soft signaling. Going in and being, however caring, being overbearing, being too judgmental, being confrontational, and generally feeling like you're telling somebody off or telling somebody what to do, particularly with teenagers, doesn't go down very well. And the soft signaling is a much more measured, still firm, but a much more measured approach. And it's raising concerns and it's asking questions rather than making statements. And it's normally a really good idea to ask somebody how they are and say, you don't need to tell me how you're feeling now, but I want you to know that I am here. I'm not going to judge. And I am just noticing the fact that your behaviour has changed. It may be because you're feeling stressed about A-levels or GCSEs, or you've got problems at school. But I just want you to know that I am here and you can always come and talk to me. And also there's people at school, teachers and peers, who will really want to help if you're struggling. And in my experience, that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks for parents, is understandably, and for teachers, they can sometimes be, with very good intentions, a little bit too robust and too confrontational. And I don't think that's always the best approach. The final one is to say that I believe that for anyone to achieve sobriety and for anyone to feel that they are coming to terms with an addiction, one of the most important things is that the person with the addiction is actually willing and able to acknowledge the fact that they have a problem. And families and friends can only do so much to support and assist somebody when they are struggling. And there's no way that somebody will have the life that they want if they can't come to terms. Yes, I believe that people should address the causes of their problems, but they're not going to be able to address the causes if they can't look and manage the symptoms. And a good friend of mine who is an addiction counsellor said that he has lost count of the number of people that have come to see him and said, I just cannot understand why I keep doing this. And his recommendation to them is, if you stop engaging in whatever it is you're engaging with for about 2 to 3 weeks, you will get a very, very clear idea of what it is that's driving you. And I would just say, from a position of compassion, but also being, I think, pragmatic and realistic, it is very important for anybody who's struggling with an addiction to realise that the onus is on them, and that the first stage of maintaining and sort of actually acquiring a sense of sustained mental and physical and emotional well-being is that they have to acknowledge the fact that they have a problem. And if they don't, I would question how sensible it is to keep giving them resources and time, because it really is fundamental for people to come to that realization on their own. I'm aware that there's probably a lot in there, but I hope that something that I've said tonight is helpful and thought-provoking, and has just helped you to have a slightly broader and more nuanced approach on a subject which is sadly quite often the subject of quite a lot of stigma and cliches. And I just hope it's been helpful and interesting. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Iain. As you said, so much to reflect on. And I hope parents and carers at home, if they're watching it now or at a later date, now understand why the senior school pupils have such a connection with you in terms of your delivery, in terms of your authenticity, and what you bring when you speak. It is so inspiring, and we are so grateful to have you part of the Forest family. So we haven't got time for questions this evening, and there's lots of thank yous on the chat, but not so many questions. And I understand it's a broad and sensitive topic for some. So what I ask and plea, and Iain, you said it because you know Forest so well, please do utilise your child's core team, which are members, as always, of the pastoral safeguarding team, but come to any Forest staff member if you do want to discuss this further. Iain so kindly will answer any questions if you do have any, so please do send them directly through to your child's tutor or to myself or even to Miss Arthur, who's our head of RSHE, and we can collate those and send them over to Iain. And we're so excited, Iain, to actually see you in person, because you delivered fantastically online, but you know, when you're in front of the pupils, it is so powerful and so moving, and they take so much away. So we are so excited to welcome you back when it's a little bit warmer at Forest. And just want to thank those people that joined us this evening. And yeah, there's still loads of thank yous coming through. So I'll make sure I pass them on, and lots of people saying they'll want to watch it again and digest it again. So once again, thank you. I hope you have a wonderful evening, Iain, and wonderful evening to those that are watching. And we look forward to seeing you on Monday, the 20th of January for our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.